Today we have a story that will shake you to your core. It's about courage found in the most unlikely place, about a choice made in darkness that would echo through generations, and about the kind of horror that doesn't need ghosts or demons because the truth is far more terrifying. This is the story of what happened beneath the Harrove plantation in Tolbert County, Georgia, in 1864, and the child who risked everything for a stranger. If you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing and becoming part of our community. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing from our amazing viewers all around the world. The spring of 1864 arrived in Tolbert County with the kind of oppressive heat that made the air shimmer above the cotton fields like water over hot stones. The Harrove plantation sprawled across 300 acres of Georgia red clay, a modest operation by the standards of wealthier families in neighboring counties, but substantial enough to require 32 enslaved people to keep it running. Among those enslaved was a girl named Grace, 11 years old, small for her age, with quick hands and watchful eyes that had learned early to see everything and reveal nothing. Her skin was the color of polished walnut, her hair kept short and covered with a faded cloth. She moved through the world like a shadow, present but unnoticed, which was exactly how she'd survived this long. Grace worked in the main house, scrubbing floors, emptying chamber pots, fetching water from the well, performing the 100 invisible tasks that kept the Harrove household functioning. Her mother had been sold away when Grace was 6, sent to a plantation in Alabama to settle a gambling debt. Grace had screamed and clung to her mother's skirts, and the overseer, a thick-necked man named Virgil Cates, had torn her away and locked her in the smokehouse for 2 days to teach her about obedience. Grace slept in a narrow space beneath the kitchen stairs, a crawl space barely tall enough for her to sit upright, accessible through a small door that most people assumed was just a storage closet. The space was perhaps 4 feet wide and 6 feet long, with a dirt floor and walls made of rough planks that let in drafts during winter. She had a thin blanket, a straw pallet that smelled of mildew, and a small wooden box where she kept her few possessions. A smooth river stone she'd found by the creek, a piece of blue glass from a broken bottle, and a scrap of fabric that had once been part of her mother's dress. It wasn't much, but it was hers. And in a world where she owned nothing, not even herself, that mattered. Thomas Harrove ran his plantation with the cold efficiency of a man who viewed human beings as livestock, valuable when productive, disposable when not. He was 43 years old, with thinning hair and a face that had settled into permanent lines of suspicion and calculation. His wife, Margaret, rarely left her upstairs bedroom, her health deteriorating from what the local doctor vaguely termed nervous exhaustion. The servants whispered that she'd lost 3 children in infancy, that the grief had broken something inside her that could never be repaired. The night everything changed, Grace woke to sounds that didn't belong. It was late April, and through the gaps in the floorboards above her head, she could hear Thomas Harrove's boots pacing back and forth across the kitchen. His voice was low and urgent, speaking to someone she couldn't see. Grace had learned to wake at the slightest unusual sound. It was a survival skill, like knowing when to make herself invisible or when to speak. She pressed her ear against the gap between 2 floorboards, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You're certain nobody saw you bring him here?" Thomas asked, his voice carrying a note of panic that Grace had never heard before. "Found him collapsed in the North Woods," came Virgil's rough reply. "Got a bullet in his shoulder. Fever burning him up something fierce. He won't last the night without help. Then let him die in the woods. Why in heaven's name did you bring him to my house?" There was a pause. Grace could hear the scrape of a chair being pulled across the floor. "Because he's got information," Virgil said quietly, "about the Union movement. He's a Confederate scout, been operating behind enemy lines for 3 months. Says he's got intelligence that could change everything. But he needs time to recover, and he needs to stay hidden." Grace lay in her crawl space, processing what she'd heard. A wounded Confederate soldier hidden somewhere beneath her feet. A man who would be killed if the Union found him. A spy with secrets that might prolong the war, might keep people like her in chains for years longer. She should have stayed silent, should have pretended she'd heard nothing. But Grace had learned long ago that information was the only currency enslaved people possessed. And knowing things that others didn't could mean the difference between survival and destruction. But there was something else too, something she couldn't quite name. A curiosity about this wounded man, this spy being hidden like contraband. What kind of person was he? What had he seen? And why did she feel a strange kinship with someone who was, by all logic, her enemy? Part 2. The discovery. The next morning, Grace went about her duties as usual, emptying the chamber pots, scrubbing the front hall with lye soap that made her hands crack and bleed, preparing breakfast under the sharp eye of Ruth, the cook. Ruth was a large woman in her 50s, with gray hair and a face that revealed nothing. She ruled the kitchen with an iron spoon and a suspicious nature, watching everything, trusting no one. "You're moving slow this morning," Ruth observed, stirring a pot of grits. "You sick?" "No, ma'am, just tired." "Tired? You're 11 years old, you don't know what tired is." Grace said nothing. There was no point in arguing. "Go down to the cellar and fetch me 2 jars of preserves," Ruth said. "The peach, not the blackberry, and don't take all day about it." Grace took a candle and made her way down the narrow stairs to the cellar. The space was low-ceilinged and damp, smelling of earth and mildew, and the sharp tang of vinegar from the pickle barrels. A single small window near the ceiling let in a weak shaft of morning light. The cellar was lined with rough wooden shelves holding jars of vegetables, smoked meat hanging from hooks, sacks of cornmeal and flour, barrels of salt pork. Grace moved slowly along the shelves, her eyes searching. At the back of the cellar, behind the preserves, she found what she was looking for, a section of wall that didn't quite match the rest. The boards were newer, the nails less rusted, fitted together to seal off what had once been a doorway. Grace pressed her ear against the wood and held her breath, listening. At first, nothing. Then, so faint she almost missed it, the sound of labored breathing. Someone was behind that wall and they were suffering. She could hear the wet rattle in their lungs, the occasional moan of pain. The man was alive, but barely. Grace grabbed 2 jars of peach preserves and hurried back upstairs, her mind racing. She said nothing to Ruth, nothing to anyone. But that night, lying in her crawl space, she couldn't stop thinking about the man sealed behind that wall. She imagined him in total darkness, wounded and alone, dependent entirely on Virgil Cates for survival. And she wondered what would happen if Virgil decided the man was more trouble than he was worth. She'd seen Virgil's cruelty before, seen him beat a man unconscious for dropping a water bucket. Virgil had no mercy in him, no compassion. If the wounded soldier became a liability, Virgil would let him die without a second thought. 3 days passed. Grace watched Virgil carefully, noting when he disappeared into the main house at odd hours, always carrying something. A canteen, a bundle wrapped in cloth, a small wooden box that might have contained medical supplies. He was feeding the hidden man, keeping him alive, but Virgil's face grew increasingly troubled. On the 3rd evening, while Grace was polishing silver in the dining room, she overheard Virgil arguing with Thomas in the study. "He's getting worse," Virgil said, his voice tight with frustration. "Infection's spreading. The wound's gone putrid. He needs a real doctor." "Absolutely not," Thomas replied, his voice firm. "We bring a doctor here, we might as well send up a signal flare for the Union. If he dies, he dies. We'll bury him in the woods and no one will ever know he was here." Grace heard Virgil's sharp intake of breath. "You're a coward." "I'm a realist. The Confederacy is losing this war. Everyone knows it. Sherman's marching through Georgia like a plague. When the Union wins, I want to be able to prove my loyalty so they don't burn my house and confiscate my property." Grace heard footsteps, heard Virgil storm out of the study, slamming the door behind him. She quickly returned to polishing the silver, her hands shaking. The wounded soldier was going to die. Thomas had made his decision, and there was nothing anyone could do about it, except there was. There was something Grace could do. That night, she made a decision that would alter the course of everything that followed. She waited until the house was silent, until even Ruth's snoring had settled into a steady rhythm. Then she slipped out of her crawl space, took a candle stub and a friction match from the kitchen drawer, and crept down to the cellar. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. At the back section, she examined the sealed doorway closely. The boards had been nailed in place carelessly. One board near the bottom was loose, probably from age and moisture. Grace worked at the loose board with her fingers. It took several minutes, her fingernails breaking, splinters driving into her skin. But finally the board came free with a soft creak. Behind it was darkness and the overwhelming smell of sickness. "Who's there?" The voice was weak, barely more than a whisper carrying a note of panic. Grace pressed her face close to the opening. "I'm not going to hurt you. I brought water." Part 3. A quiet covenant. Grace passed a tin cup filled with cool water through the gap. She heard movement, the sound of someone dragging themselves across a dirt floor with agonizing slowness. Then the cup was taken from her hand with trembling fingers. The man drank desperately, water spilling down his chin. When he finally lowered the cup, his breathing was ragged, labored. "Thank you," he managed. "Thank you, heaven bless you." "You're the Confederate scout," Grace whispered. "I heard them talking about you." A pause. "Who are you?" "Nobody. Just a girl who works in the house. They don't see me, I'm invisible." "You shouldn't be here. If they catch you," he broke off, coughing, a wet, painful sound that went on for nearly a minute. When he finally stopped, his breathing was even more labored than before. "They won't catch me, I'm careful." Grace hesitated, then asked the question burning in her mind. "Are you going to die?" Another pause, longer this time. "Probably. The wound's infected. I can feel it spreading through my body like fire. Another few days, maybe a week." His voice was matter of fact, resigned. "I've seen enough death to know what it looks like." Grace thought about the casual cruelty she'd witnessed her entire life. The way people like Thomas Harrove and Virgil Cates treated human beings as property, as tools to be used and discarded when they broke. She thought about her mother, sold away to Alabama, probably dead by now. She thought about the Union soldiers supposedly coming to free people like her, though she'd learned not to trust promises from white men in uniforms. And she thought about this man behind the wall, dying slowly in the dark because Thomas Harrove valued his own safety more than another person's life. "I know about medicine," she said quietly. "Not much, but some. Ruth taught me things, herbs and poultices, how to clean wounds, how to reduce fever. I could help you. I could try, at least." "Why would you do that?" The man's voice was confused, almost suspicious. "I'm a Confederate soldier. If the Union wins, people like you go free. You should want me to die." Grace considered this. It was a fair question. "Maybe," she said slowly. "Or maybe we just get different masters. I don't know what's going to happen. Nobody does. But I know what it's like to be trapped somewhere with nobody to help you. I know what it's like to be invisible, to have people walk past you like you don't exist. And I know I can't just let you die when I might be able to do something." She heard him shift in the darkness. "What's your name?" "Grace." "I'm Daniel. Daniel Pritchard, 3rd Georgia Infantry, Company B." He coughed again, but less violently. "If you're serious about helping me, Grace, you need to understand something. If they catch you coming down here, they'll punish you severely. And if they realize you know about me, they might kill you to keep the secret safe. Thomas Harrove is desperate, and desperate men do terrible things." "I know." "Then why risk it?" Grace thought about this question for a long moment. Finally she said, "Because I'm tired of being invisible. Because I'm tired of watching people suffer and not doing anything about it. Because maybe if I save one person, it means something. Maybe it means I'm not just property. Maybe it means I'm a person who can make choices." Daniel was quiet for so long that Grace thought he might have passed out. Then, softly, "You're braver than most soldiers I've known." Grace replaced the loose board carefully, making sure it looked undisturbed. She took her candle and crept back upstairs, her heart pounding with fear and something else, something that felt almost like purpose. For the first time in her life, She was doing something that mattered, something that was her choice and hers alone. The next night she returned with water and a piece of cornbread wrapped in cloth. The night after that, she brought strips of dried meat and a boiled egg. Ruth noticed nothing. Grace had learned long ago how to take just enough to avoid detection. On the fourth night, she brought clean rags and a jar of salve that Ruth used for burns, made from lard and crushed plantain leaves. Through the gap in the boards, working by candlelight, Grace cleaned Daniel's wound as best she could. The bullet had passed through his shoulder, but both wounds were badly infected, the flesh around them hot and swollen. The smell was overwhelming, but Grace forced herself not to gag. She'd seen infected wounds before. She knew what to do. She packed the wounds with salve, changed the bandages, brought him willow bark tea to reduce the fever. It was slow, dangerous work. Every night, Grace risked discovery. Every night she expected to hear Thomas Harrove's footsteps on the cellar stairs, to feel Virgil Cate's hand on her shoulder. But somehow, impossibly, she remained undetected. Gradually, over the course of weeks, Daniel began to improve. The fever broke on the fifth night. The infection receded slowly. His voice grew stronger, his breathing became easier. And in the darkness of the sealed root cellar, with only a gap in the boards between them, they talked. Daniel told her about his life before the war. A small farm in northern Georgia, a wife named Catherine, a daughter named Emma who would be 7 years old now. "I used to think it was about states' rights," he said one night, his voice quiet in the darkness. "That's what they told us. But the longer this war goes on, the more I see what it's really about. It's about keeping people like you in chains." Grace listened, saying little. She appreciated his honesty, even if it came too late to change anything. But a new danger was emerging, one that would test everything Grace had risked. Part 4, the breaking point. As May turned to June, Daniel's recovery continued. Grace had managed to bring him a blanket, a bucket, a small tin plate and spoon. The space was still cramped and dark and miserable, but it was better than it had been. But Virgil Cates had stopped coming. Grace realized this after several nights of not seeing him slip into the house at odd hours. When she asked Daniel about it, his response was grim. "He came 3 days ago. Said the union's getting too close, that it's too dangerous to keep me here. Said he'd bring food one more time, then I was on my own. Said I should be strong enough to break out and make my own way north." Daniel's voice was flat, emotionless. "He hasn't come back. I think Harrove ordered him to let me starve. Easier than killing me outright. Less blood on their hands." Grace felt a cold fury settle in her chest, familiar and almost comforting. She'd felt it before when her mother was sold, when she'd watched Virgil beat a man unconscious for dropping a bucket. "Then I'll bring you more food, enough to keep you going." "Grace, you can't. You're already taking too much risk. If they catch you, they won't. You're getting careless. You're coming down here every night. Someone's going to notice. Ruth's going to notice the missing food. And when they do, they'll kill you, not punish you, kill you, because you know too much and dead people don't talk. I don't care. You should care. You're 11 years old. You have your whole life ahead of you. The war is going to end soon and you'll be free. Don't throw that away for me." "Free doesn't change everything," Grace said bitterly. "I'll still be black in a world run by white people. I'll still be poor. I'll still have nothing." But she knew Daniel was right. Ruth was already giving her suspicious looks, noticing the missing food, the way Grace was always tired in the mornings. And Virgil had started watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl, as if he suspected something but couldn't quite figure out what. The situation reached a crisis point in late June. Grace was in the kitchen preparing dinner, peeling potatoes, stirring a pot of beans. The heat was oppressive, and sweat ran down her back. Through the thin walls, she could hear Thomas and Virgil arguing in the study. "I want him gone," Thomas said, his voice sharp. "Tonight, I don't care if he's recovered or not. Take him into the woods and leave him there. If he dies, he dies." "He can barely walk," Virgil protested. "His shoulder's still weak. You're signing his death warrant. Better his death than mine. The union's within 20 miles of here. They're searching every plantation, every farm, every house. If they find him, we'll all hang. He's got information. I don't care about his information. The Confederacy is losing. Richmond's going to fall. Lee's going to surrender. When it is, I want to be able to look the Union soldiers in the eye and say I never harbored Confederate fugitives. You're a coward. I'm a survivor. Now get him out of my house. Tonight, that's an order. Grace's hands froze. She had to warn Daniel, had to get him out before Virgil came for him. But how? Where could he go? He was still weak, still recovering. The woods were full of Union patrols. He'd be caught within a day. That night, she didn't wait for the house to settle. As soon as Ruth retired to her corner, Grace slipped down to the cellar, her heart racing. She pried loose the board and whispered urgently into the darkness. "Daniel, they're coming for you tonight. You have to leave now." She heard him move, heard the pain in his sharp intake of breath. "I can't. I'm not strong enough yet. I can walk, but not far, not fast." "Then I'll help you." "Grace, no. If they catch you helping me escape, I don't care. I'm not letting them kill you, not after everything." She worked frantically at the other boards, pulling them loose one by one. Splinters drove into her palms, her fingernails tore. Blood ran down her fingers, but she didn't stop. Finally, she'd created an opening large enough for Daniel to crawl through. He emerged slowly, painfully. In the candlelight, Grace saw him clearly for the first time. He was younger than she'd imagined, maybe 25, with a gaunt face and hollow eyes. His left arm hung useless at his side. He was thin, emaciated, his clothes hanging off his frame. He looked at her, and she saw something in his expression that might have been wonder. "You're just a child," he said softly. "I'm old enough to know right from wrong. Now come on." She helped him up the cellar stairs, supporting his weight as best she could. They made it to the kitchen, and Grace was reaching for the back door when she heard footsteps on the front porch. Virgil Cates coming to carry out Thomas's orders. Grace made a split-second decision. She shoved Daniel toward her crawl space beneath the stairs. "Get in there. Don't make a sound." Daniel squeezed into the narrow space, his face contorting with pain. Grace pushed the small door shut just as Virgil entered the kitchen. He stopped when he saw her, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "What are you doing up?" "Couldn't sleep. Came to get water." Grace kept her voice steady, though her heart was hammering. She moved to the water bucket, dipped a cup, drank slowly. Virgil studied her for a long moment, looking for signs of deception. Finally, he grunted and moved past her toward the cellar door. Grace stood frozen, listening to his footsteps descending. She heard his curse of surprise when he discovered the loose boards, heard him moving around the root cellar, searching. When he came back up, his face was dark with fury. He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and grabbed her by the arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "Where is he?" Before Grace could answer, a voice spoke from the doorway. "Let her go." Part 5. The choice Daniel stood there, swaying slightly, his good hand gripping a kitchen knife. He looked like he might collapse at any moment, his face pale and slick with sweat, but his eyes were hard. Virgil released Grace and turned to face Daniel. "You're in no condition to fight me, boy." "Maybe not, but I can make enough noise to wake the whole house. And then Thomas Harrove will have to explain to everyone why there's a Confederate deserter in his cellar. His wife, his neighbors, the Union patrols searching the area. Everyone will know. I'm no deserter. That's what they'll call you when I tell them you've been hiding here for 2 months instead of reporting back to your unit. That's what the military tribunal will call you before they hang you for cowardice." Daniel's voice was cold, harder than Grace had ever heard it. "Let us go and I'll disappear. You'll never see me again. Nobody has to know I was ever here." Virgil's jaw worked, his hands clenching and unclenching. Grace could see him calculating, weighing his options, trying to figure out which choice would cause him the least trouble. Finally, he stepped back. "You've got until dawn. After that, I'm reporting you to the Confederate authorities. They'll hunt you down like a dog." He looked at Grace, and there was something almost like pity in his eyes. "You're a fool, girl. You threw away your life for a man who'll be dead in a week. Was it worth it?" "Yes," Grace said quietly. "It was my choice to make. That makes it worth it." Virgil left without another word. Grace and Daniel stood in the kitchen, the weight of what they'd just done settling over them. "We need to go," Daniel said, "now before he changes his mind." "Where?" "North, toward the Union lines. It's the only chance." Grace thought about what she was leaving behind, the only home she'd ever known, brutal as it was. Ruth, who'd taught her to survive. The other enslaved people on the plantation. But she also thought about the alternative. Staying here pretending the last 2 months had never happened, waiting for Virgil or Thomas to decide she knew too much. "All right," she said. "Let's go." They left through the back door, moving as quickly as Daniel's weakened state allowed. The night was thick with humidity, the air heavy with the scent of magnolia and honeysuckle. The moon was a thin crescent, providing barely enough light to see by. They made it to the tree line, and Grace heard a sound that made her blood run cold. Dogs barking. "They're coming after us already," Daniel said, his breathing labored. "Virgil must have changed his mind." They pushed deeper into the woods, branches tearing at their clothes, roots threatening to trip them. Daniel was breathing hard, his face pale in the moonlight. Grace knew he couldn't keep this pace for long. Behind them, the dogs grew louder, their barking frenzied. Grace could hear men's voices shouting, could see the flicker of torches through the trees. They were being hunted like animals. "Leave me," Daniel gasped, stumbling. "You can move faster without me." "No, Grace," I said. "No. We started this together, we finish it together." Grace's mind raced. Then she remembered something Ruth had told her once about how to throw dogs off a scent. It was an old trick, passed down from people who tried to escape. "There's a creek about half a mile east," she said, her breath coming in gasps. "If we can reach it, we can wade downstream. The water will hide our scent." They changed direction, angling toward where Grace remembered the creek running. The dogs were getting closer, their barking frenzied now. Grace could hear them crashing through the underbrush, could hear the men urging them on. They reached the creek just as the first dog burst through the underbrush behind them. Grace and Daniel plunged into the water, gasping at the cold shock. The water was waist-deep on Grace, chest-deep on Daniel, and the current was stronger than she'd remembered. They began wading downstream, fighting to keep their footing on the slippery stones. The dog reached the creek bank and stopped, confused, casting back and forth for the scent. More dogs arrived and more men. Grace counted 4 torches. She and Daniel pressed themselves against the far bank, hidden in the shadow of an overhanging willow tree, and held their breath. "Lost the trail," one of the men said, his voice carrying across the water. "Spread out, check both banks, they can't have gone far." The men moved along the creek bank, searching. Grace and Daniel stayed perfectly still, the cold water lapping at their chins. A mosquito landed on Grace's cheek and bit her, but she didn't move, didn't even blink. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the search party moved on, heading upstream instead of down. The sounds of dogs and men gradually faded. Grace and Daniel waited until the sounds faded completely. Then they climbed out on the far side, their clothes soaked and heavy. "We need to find shelter," Daniel said, his teeth chattering. "Somewhere to hide until I'm strong enough to travel properly." Grace thought about this, running through her mental map of the area. "There's an old tobacco barn about 3 miles from here, been abandoned for years. Nobody goes there anymore. Can you find it in the dark?" "I think so." They walked through the night, moving slowly, stopping frequently to let Daniel rest. By the time the sky began to lighten in the east, they'd reached the barn. It was a sagging structure with half its roof missing and walls covered in creeping vines. They collapsed inside, too exhausted to speak. Grace found some old burlap sacks in a corner and used them to make a rough bed. Daniel lay down with a groan. "Thank you," he whispered, his eyes already closing. "For everything." Grace sat beside him, her back against the wall, keeping watch. "Don't thank me yet. We're not safe. We're not even close to safe." "No, but we're alive. That's more than I expected." Grace looked out through the broken window at the dawn breaking over the Georgia woods, and for the first time in her life, she felt something that might have been hope. Part 6. The long journey. They stayed in the abandoned barn for 3 weeks, hiding during the day, moving only at night. Grace foraged for food, wild blackberries, edible roots, wild onions. She filled a canteen from a stream. Once, she even managed to snare a rabbit using a trap she'd learned to make from watching the men on the plantation. Daniel's strength slowly returned. The wound in his shoulder healed, though his left arm would never regain its full strength. They talked during the long hours of hiding. Daniel told her more about his life, about his wife Catherine and his daughter Emma. He talked about his plans, how he intended to desert the Confederate army, make his way north, start over somewhere far from Georgia. "I shot a man once," he said one night, his voice barely above a whisper. Union soldier, couldn't have been more than 18 years old. He was wounded, lying in a ditch, calling for his mother. I could have taken him prisoner. But my commanding officer said we didn't have time, so I shot him. I can still see his face, still hear him calling for his mother. Grace listened, saying nothing. The war had turned everyone into something they'd never imagined themselves capable of being. She told him about her own life, about the small rebellions that had kept her sane, about teaching herself to read, about her mother and the day she was sold. "Do you think you'll ever see her again?" Daniel asked. "No, she's probably dead. Most people don't last long on the Alabama plantations." "I'm sorry." "Everyone's sorry. Sorry doesn't bring her back." In early August, they finally felt strong enough to continue north. They traveled by night, following the North Star, avoiding roads and towns. They passed through forests and fields, crossed rivers, hid from Confederate patrols and Union scouts alike. They survived on foraged food and stolen vegetables, on water from streams and the occasional kindness of enslaved people who saw them passing through and left food where they could find it. A loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, a jar of preserves, a smoked ham. These anonymous gifts kept them alive. Then, on a night in mid-August, everything changed. They were moving through a dense pine forest when they heard voices ahead. Men speaking in low tones, the clink of metal on metal, the sound of a camp settling in for the night. "Patrol's due back in an hour," one voice said. "If they're not here by then, we assume they've been captured or killed. These woods are crawling with deserters from both sides. Captain says we're moving out at dawn, heading toward Monroe. Should be there in 3 days if we don't run into trouble." Union soldiers. They'd finally reached the Federal lines. Daniel looked at Grace, and she saw the hope in his eyes mixed with fear and uncertainty. They'd made it. Against all odds, they'd actually made it. They stepped out of the trees, hands raised, moving slowly. The Union soldiers spun toward them, rifles raised, and for a moment, Grace thought they might shoot first and ask questions later. But then an officer stepped forward, a young man with lieutenant's bars on his shoulders, studying them in the moonlight. "Who are you?" he demanded, his hand on his pistol. "Daniel Pritchard, 3rd Georgia Infantry. I'm deserting, and this is Grace. She saved my life. She's been traveling with me for 2 months, helping me reach your lines." The officer's eyes moved from Daniel to Grace, taking in her torn dress, her bare feet, the exhaustion etched into her young face. "How old are you, girl?" 11, sir." Something shifted in the officer's expression, surprise perhaps, or respect or pity. "You've been traveling with this man alone for 2 months." "Yes, sir. I helped him escape from the plantation where I was enslaved. We've been hiding, moving at night, trying to reach the Union lines." The officer was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. Then he lowered his rifle and gestured to his men to do the same. "You're safe now, both of you. Come with us." They were taken to a Union camp, a sprawling collection of tents and wagons and campfires. Grace had never seen so many soldiers in one place. They were given food, real food, and clean clothes, though the smallest uniform they could find for Grace still hung off her like a sack. Grace was questioned extensively about the Harrove plantation, its location, its defenses, the number of enslaved people there, the layout of the buildings. She answered as best she could, though she felt a strange guilt about betraying the place that had been her prison. Daniel was questioned, too, about Confederate troop movements and strategies. He provided what information he could, though he made it clear he wanted no part in the war anymore. 3 days later, a Union regiment moved on the Harrove plantation. Grace wasn't there to see it, but she heard about it afterward. Thomas Harrove had fled before they arrived, taking his wife and whatever valuables they could carry. They'd headed west toward Alabama. Virgil Cates had tried to fight, barricading himself in the main house with a rifle. He'd been shot by Union soldiers when he refused to surrender. He died on the front porch. The enslaved people had been freed, though Grace learned that freedom meant being herded into contraband camps, where conditions were often as bad as the plantations they'd left. The camps were overcrowded, disease-ridden, with inadequate food and shelter. Freedom, it turned out, was more complicated than anyone had imagined. Part 7. The Reckoning. Daniel left the camp in September, heading north toward Pennsylvania, where he hoped to find work and eventually send for his family. He said goodbye to Grace with tears in his eyes, pressing a small carved wooden bird into her hand, something he'd made during their weeks in the barn. "You saved my life," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll never forget that. You're the bravest person I've ever met. If I ever have another daughter, I'm going to name her Grace in your honor." "What will you do?" Grace asked, turning the wooden bird over in her hands. It was beautifully carved, with delicate wings and a tiny beak. "Try to be a better man than I was. Try to make something good out of all this suffering. Try to teach my daughter that all people are equal, that slavery was wrong." He paused, looking at her intently. "What about you? What will you do?" Grace looked around the camp at the soldiers and the freed slaves and the endless confusion of war. "I don't know yet, but I'll figure it out. I always do." She never saw Daniel again. Years later, she heard that he'd made it to Pennsylvania, that he'd been reunited with his family, that he'd lived a quiet life as a carpenter until his death in 1889. She heard that he'd had another daughter born in 1867, and that he'd named her Elizabeth Grace for short. She didn't know if it was true, but she hoped it was. She hoped he'd found peace, hoped he'd kept his promise to be a better man. As for Grace, she stayed with the Union Army as it moved through Georgia, working as a laundress and cook. The work was hard, but no harder than what she'd done on the plantation. And at least now she was paid. A few dollars a month, barely enough to survive on, but it was hers. She saved every penny, hiding the coins in a small cloth bag she kept tied around her waist. When the war ended in 1865, she made her way to Atlanta, where she found work in a boarding house run by a free black woman named Hannah. Hannah was in her 40s, stern but fair, and she took Grace under her wing, teaching her how to run a household, how to manage money, how to navigate the complicated world of Reconstruction. Grace learned to read and write properly, studying by candlelight after her work was done. She learned arithmetic, keeping the boarding house's books, balancing accounts. She learned how to deal with white people who still saw her as property, how to stand her ground without getting herself killed. In 1870, at the age of 17, Grace opened her own boarding house using the money she'd saved and a loan from Hannah. It was a small place, just 6 rooms, but it was hers. She catered to newly freed black families trying to build lives in the aftermath of slavery, offering them clean rooms and hot meals, and a safe place to stay while they looked for work. She charged fair prices, never gouged, and she had a reputation for helping people in desperate situations, offering shelter to those who couldn't pay, providing food to families on the edge of starvation. One evening in the summer of 1872, a woman came to the boarding house. She was middle-aged, thin, with gray in her hair and tired eyes. She asked about a room, and as Grace showed her upstairs, the woman stopped suddenly on the landing. "Do I know you?" the woman asked, studying Grace's face. "You look familiar." Grace looked at the woman more closely. There was something about her eyes, something about the shape of her face. "What's your name?" Grace asked quietly. "Ruth. I used to work as a cook on a plantation in Tolbert County, the Harrove place. Been wandering since the war ended, looking for work, looking for—" She stopped, her eyes widening. "Grace. Little Grace from under the kitchen stairs." Grace felt something catch in her throat. Ruth. They stood there on the landing, two women who'd survived what should have destroyed them, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "I thought you died," Ruth said finally, her voice breaking. "When you disappeared that night with the Confederate soldier, I thought Virgil had killed you. I thought I'd never see you again." "I ran," Grace said simply. "We both did. And we made it." Ruth reached out and touched Grace's face gently, as if to make sure she was real. "You were always stronger than you looked, always braver than you should have been. You taught me that. You taught me how to survive." "No," Ruth said softly. "You taught yourself. I just showed you which plants wouldn't kill you." Grace gave Ruth a room free of charge, and over the following weeks, Ruth told her what had happened after she'd fled. How the plantation had burned, how the enslaved people had scattered, how Ruth had searched for Grace for months before giving up hope. "I'm glad you made it out," Ruth said one evening as they sat together in the boarding house kitchen, drinking tea. "I'm glad you saved that soldier, even though it nearly got you killed. You did something that mattered. You made a choice. That's more than most of us ever got." Grace kept the carved wooden bird Daniel had given her on a shelf in her room until the day she died in 1903 at the age of 50. In her will, she left her boarding house to be used as a school for black children, with a stipulation that it should always offer refuge to those fleeing violence or persecution. The building stood until 1947, when it was torn down to make way for a highway. But the school continued in a new location, and it still operates today. Part 8. What Remains in 1925. A construction crew breaking ground for a new house in what had once been Tolbert County discovered something remarkable. While excavating the old Harrove property, they found the sealed root cellar, buried under layers of dirt and time. They found scratches on the walls, hundreds of them, tiny marks that might have been someone counting days. They found a rusted chain, though nobody could explain what it had been attached to or why it was there. They found something else too, a small wooden door, barely large enough for a child, hidden behind a false wall. And carved into the wood, in letters so small they were almost invisible, were two words: "Grace helped." The discovery made the local newspapers, sparking speculation about what had happened in that cellar 60 years earlier. But by then, everyone who might have known the truth was dead. Thomas and Margaret Harrove had disappeared into Alabama and were never heard from again. Virgil Cates was buried in an unmarked grave somewhere on the plantation grounds. The enslaved people who'd lived there had scattered to the winds, their stories lost to history. The story became a local legend, whispered about but never confirmed. People speculated. Maybe it was a hiding place for runaway slaves. Maybe it was where the Harroves kept prisoners. Maybe it was something darker. The truth was both simpler and more complicated than any of the legends. It wasn't until 1931, when a historian researching Union military records stumbled across a report filed by Lieutenant James Morrison in August 1864, that pieces of the puzzle began to come together. The report mentioned a young enslaved girl who'd helped a Confederate deserter escape, who'd provided valuable intelligence about plantation defenses, who'd shown remarkable courage. The report didn't give her name, just referred to her as a Negro child, approximately 11 years of age. The historian tried to track down more information, but the trail went cold. There were no photographs of Grace, no letters, no official records of her life after the war. Just that one report and the carved words in the cellar door, and the memories of a few elderly people in Atlanta who remembered a boarding house owner who'd once told them about hiding a wounded soldier when she was a child. The story might have ended there, forgotten again, if not for one final discovery. In 1958, a woman named Sarah Pritchard, researching her family genealogy, found a journal that had belonged to her great-grandfather, Daniel Pritchard. In it, he'd written extensively about his time in Georgia during the war, about the plantation where he'd hidden, and about the young girl who'd saved his life. The journal entries were detailed, almost obsessive, as if Daniel had been trying to preserve every memory, every conversation, every moment of those 9 months. "I have lived 40 years since that night," he wrote in an entry dated 1904, a year after Grace's death, though he didn't know she died. "I have built a life, raised children, tried to be a good man, but I have never forgotten the courage of that child who had every reason to let me die and chose instead to save me. I pray that she found peace and happiness, that the war gave her the freedom she deserved. I pray that somewhere, somehow, she knows that her kindness mattered, that it changed everything, that it changed me." He wrote about naming his second daughter Elizabeth, about telling her the story of the girl who'd saved his life, about teaching all his children that slavery was evil and that they had a responsibility to fight for justice and equality. Sarah Pritchard published excerpts from the journal in a small historical society newsletter in 1959. It was picked up by a few newspapers, and eventually, someone in Atlanta made the connection to the boarding house owner who died in 1903. The pieces finally came together, and the full story of Grace and Daniel emerged from the shadows of history. What happened in that cellar beneath the Harrove plantation was exactly what the evidence suggested: an act of extraordinary courage by a child who had no reason to risk everything for a stranger and who did it anyway. There was no supernatural element, no divine intervention, no fairy tale ending, just two people trying to survive in a world that wanted them dead, choosing to help each other when they had every reason not to. The Harrove plantation is gone now, the land covered by suburban houses and shopping centers. But if you know where to look, you can still find the old foundation, still see the outline of where the cellar once stood. And if you're very quiet, if you let yourself imagine what happened there all those years ago, you can almost hear the whisper of two voices in the darkness: a wounded soldier and a child who refused to let him die, making a choice that would echo through generations. That's the real horror of this story, isn't it? Not ghosts or demons or supernatural evil, but the simple, terrible fact that a child had to risk her life to save someone. That the world was so broken that an act of basic human decency became an act of extraordinary courage. That's the nightmare that should keep us awake at night. Not the thought of what might be lurking in the dark, but the memory of what we've done to each other in the light of day. The cellar door is gone now, torn down and destroyed decades ago. But the words carved into it, "Grace helped," remain in photographs taken by the construction crew in 1925, preserved in the archives of the Tolbert County Historical Society. Two words that tell a story of courage, compassion, and the choice to do what's right, even when the cost is almost unbearable. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all we can ask for, that someone, somewhere remembers. That the story doesn't die. That Grace's choice, made in a cellar in Georgia in 1864, continues to matter more than a century later. Because in the end, that's all any of us can hope for. That our choices matter, that our actions have meaning, that the things we do in the darkness will someday be brought into the light. This is the story of what happened beneath the Harrove plantation. A story recovered from old records, military reports, journal entries, and whispered memories. A story about a child who refused to be invisible, who made a choice that should never have been hers to make, and who, in doing so, became more than property, more than a victim, more than a footnote in history. She became Grace, and her story finally has been told.